Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a seriously intricate, mind-bending puzzle. We're going to unpack a deeply complex theological theory that has been meticulously pieced together over nearly a decade. We are looking at the work of Alan Dubra, who presents an absolutely fascinating 14-year prophetic timeline based on a highly specific reading of the book of Zechariah. Now, whether you're deeply familiar with biblical eschatology or you just love seeing how dense ancient texts are decoded by modern researchers, this is a masterful display of pattern recognition. We're going to map out exactly how this source material reinterprets traditional timelines using a completely unique mathematical and textual cipher.
Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of such a massive timeline, we've broken it down into 5 key parts. First, decoding the prophetic mystery. Second, the chapters to years cipher. Third, years 1 through 8. Fourth, the 11th year turning point. And finally, the final prophetic countdown.
Section 1. Decoding the prophetic mystery. Challenging the 7-year paradigm.
Right off the bat, we are looking at a major departure from mainstream eschatology. On one hand, you have the traditional view that you've probably heard of, a 7-year period of tribulation. But on the other hand, we have Dubra's proposed framework, a full 14-year timeline for the end of days. According to the source material, recognizing this expanded 14-year window is the absolute foundational key to unlocking the entire prophetic mystery. And this brilliantly illustrates how the author actually arrives at that 14-year number. The source proposes this fascinating structural concept that the foundational Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which we often call the Synoptic Gospels because they summarize the life of Jesus from similar viewpoints, are actually speaking to completely distinct prophetic timeframes based on subtle differences in their wording. The book of Mark is mapped to a 7-year period of seals. Then the book of Matthew is mapped to a totally separate 7-year period of trumpets. 7 plus 7, that gives us our 14 years. Finally, Luke corresponds to what the source calls the above, which is a distinct short period of time. By separating these accounts rather than merging them together, the 14-year framework is born.
Moving right along to Section 2, the chapters to years cipher, unlocking the text. To really understand how the source builds this timeline, you have to grasp the chapters to years rule. This cipher is essential. The author posits that whoever originally divided these ancient texts into chapters was actually spirit-led, essentially embedding a prophetic cipher right into the very structure of the book. Under this cipher, a chapter number isn't just a handy organizational tool, it corresponds directly to a specific year in the end times timeline. So, chapter 1 equals year 1, chapter 4 equals year 4, and so on.
Which brings us straight to the book of Zechariah. The source points out a striking numerical alignment here. Zechariah, a book historically written to the house of Judah, contains exactly 14 chapters. Applying the cipher we just discussed, the author maps those 14 chapters directly to the 14-year timeline of the end of days. It is a perfect 1-to-1 ratio, and it sets the stage for literally everything that follows.
Section 3, years 1 through 8. The foundation is laid.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how methodically the cipher is applied chronologically to the text. The timeline kicks off in year 1, corresponding to Zechariah chapter 1, where a historic 70-year period ends, which marks the beginning of a great affliction. Then, moving forward to year 4, mapping to chapter 4, the foundation of the Lord's house is laid, but the peace doesn't last long. Fast forward to year 6, aligned with Revelation 6. This is where the wrath of the Lamb comes to defeat the beast for the very first time. The dust settles, and finally we land at year 8, which corresponds to Zechariah chapter 8. Here, the physical rebuilding of the temple actually begins. You can really feel how the author is locking each major prophetic event perfectly to a specific calendar year.
To anchor this structurally, the source points heavily to this exact quote from Zechariah chapter 4, "The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands shall also finish it." Because this is stated in chapter 4, the author concludes that the prophetic foundation of the temple is laid precisely in the 4th year of the 14-year timeline, overseen by an end-days figure mirroring the historic Zerubbabel.
But the building doesn't just resume immediately. It isn't until year 8, which the source defines as the first year of the trumpet judgments, that the actual rebuilding of the temple officially begins on top of that foundation laid back in year 4. The Lord returns to the holy mountain, and the command is given to let their hands be strong and rebuild. Let's move forward and see how this builds into the absolute most chaotic phase of the entire timeline. Section 4, the 11th year turning point, chaos and broken covenants. This is where the timeline escalates into absolute density. Following the chapters to years cipher, Zechariah chapter 11 represents the 11th year, placing us squarely at the 3.5-year mark of the trumpet judgments, often called mid-trumpets. In this single year, the construction of the temple is finally finished. But immediately following this, Satan is cast down to earth. By the latter part of year 11, a major global covenant is broken, leading straight into what is known as the abomination of desolation.
The sheer scale of the mid-trumpets escalation here is staggering. The events in chapter 11 unfold like a rapid-fire sequence of falling dominoes. First, the temple is finished, mirroring historical accounts in 1 Kings. But then, Satan is cast down. The beast ascends from the opened bottomless pit. 3 shepherds are abruptly cut off in a single month. The staff of beauty is cut asunder, completely breaking the covenant made with all people. And all of this culminates in the ultimate desecration, an event known as the abomination of desolation, where a dark figure known as the son of perdition takes a seat in the newly rebuilt temple, literally declaring himself to be God.
Section 5, the final prophetic countdown, the last 3.5 years. So the crucial point is, if we're at the middle of the 7-year trumpets period, that leaves us with exactly 3.5 years remaining. The source highlights Revelation 12:14 right here, noting that this final 3.5-year span is the exact period when the woman flies into the wilderness to be nourished and protected after Satan is cast down. But the author doesn't just treat this as one big block of time. Deborah utilizes some highly specific verbal math to break these final 3.5 years into 2 very distinct phases. He argues there is a 2.5-year period dedicated strictly to a massive war with the beast, Satan, and the false prophet. Once that 2.5-year war concludes, it leaves exactly 1 final single year, the 14th year, for the ultimate return. Now you might be wondering, where exactly does that 2.5-year war calculation come from? Well, the source points to Daniel 12:7, which describes the duration as a time, times, and in half. The author specifically points out the deliberate absence of the word "and" before the half in certain translations or readings. By calculating a time as 1, times as 2, plus a half, but interpreting the phrasing to total precisely 2.5 years, the author deduces the exact length of this great war. It's a remarkably meticulous, literal approach to the phrasing of the ancient text. Which finally brings us to year 14, mapped seamlessly to Zechariah chapter 14. According to the source, this final year aligns with Matthew 24:29. It's the end of the timeline, where the Lord returns. And interestingly, the author notes that the specific Greek phrasing in Matthew indicates returning on the clouds, landing feet down on the Mount of Olives for the final battle of Revelation 19. It is the absolute, ultimate culmination of this 14-year decoder's journey.
Wow. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, navigating a totally complex 14-year chronological puzzle built entirely on chapter numbers matching to years. Whether you view this as an incredible mathematical coincidence or a profound spiritual cipher, it forces us to look at the structure of these ancient documents in a completely new light. So I want to leave you with this final thought. How does applying a chapters to years cipher fundamentally change the way we read and interpret ancient prophetic texts? Does it uncover a hidden blueprint, or does it simply highlight our human desire to find perfect numerical order in ancient mysteries? Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we'll see you in the next explainer.